Okay, fine. So land revenue settlements, right? That is the next topic we are going to do, the land revenue settlements, right? So, you know, you already know about this, some of the ideas you must be having for this land revenue settlements in India. And in fact, throughout the beginning of the state system, throughout the beginning, from the beginning of the, state system in India, that we do know from the 6th century BC that states evolved, and once states evolved, so I hope you do understand or do remember the fact that land revenue was always the most important source of income for the state. And whenever we did discuss about the most important idea, the idea regarding surplus, so it was all about land revenue. Somehow that concept of income or the sources of income from some other, the income source from some other means such as trade, commerce, these were not very supposed to be very important initially, but and that idea even continued till the 18th century or even after 18th century also. It's it's much after then people have realized the importance of trade and commerce as a source of income, and that is why when the colonial people or the Britishers captured Bengal, and then what happened? They got this Diwani right in Bengal, and they started collecting the land revenue from this area. So these are some basic information that we do know, and you all must be knowing about this. But one thing which is very important here, that if you understand that land revenue settlements are merely an economic system through which they started collecting or extracting the land revenue from those areas, this is not true, because land revenue system was the ideas which were there before behind the implementation of the land revenue system. That's also somehow while implementing those kind of policies or those kind of land revenue settlements, there were multiple ideas which were there in their mind, which were in their mind, right? And apart from that, if we'll talk about the impacts of those land revenue policies, there also we can discuss or we can talk about multiple impacts, and these impacts were not only economic, rather you'll find that these revenue settlements had even social impacts, and that's the reason that these land revenue settlements somehow became very important. And that is why we need to understand that in a very careful way, right? One more thing is there, that whenever we are talking about these land revenue settlements, right, so somehow these land revenue settlements, to what extent increase the exploitation of the society, that also matters a lot. Because look, as far as exploitation of the peasantry community is concerned, it was always there in society. So I hope even earlier also we have discussed while discussing about the any sort of land revenue before the coming of the Britishers, that whenever the land revenues were extracted from the peasantry community, it was always a matter of question ki, was the peasantry community left with that much which was sufficient to feed them, or which was capable of getting some surplus or some property accumulation with the peasantry community or not. So these kind of questions were always there, but somehow here that question, and in fact you must know one thing, that whenever you do talk about this land revenue settlement, always it was a sort of balance which was created by some popular rulers, right? And the ruler who is very successful, if some that ruler is capable of controlling this land revenue settlement or the land revenue extraction from the peasantry community in a very balanced way, right? So if you talk about that, Akbar was a very great ruler, so there might be numbers of factors because of what Akbar became great, but at the same time Akbar is also known great because of his Mansabdari system and the Dehsala system, right? Both these systems ultimately facilitated this collection of land revenue in a better way, and I think that also added one point in the greatness of Akbar, right? If we'll talk about some other rulers from ancient India or medieval India, you'll find that all these rulers were somehow very particular about this land revenue collection, and that's the reason that these people somehow were successful for longer years, right? So what kind of balance they always used to make? So it has been said, look, there were two threats were there. So this is the line, right? And if the land revenue settlement has been fixed in this line, the things were moving properly, things were going on properly. If they have started collecting more than this expected balance, in that case what is happening? If they have started collecting more from the from this expected balance, in that case definitely it increases the exploitation of the peasantry community. And whenever there was an increased exploitation of the peasantry community, ultimately it came as a result of revolts against the ruling parties and the ruling powers, right? If they started collecting less from the peasantry community, from that balance, right, in that case you'll find that the property class, the peasantry class, specifically I must say the jamindars, right, the jamindars started accumulating property, right? And once the jamindars accumulated property, definitely the different kind of ambitions started coming into their minds, and they also revolted, right? So I think for the Mughal decline, I use two terms called as Jagirdari crisis, right? One is called as Jagirdari crisis, and the another is called as agrarian crisis, right? Jagirdari crisis and the agrarian crisis. So what is Jagirdari crisis? Right, the extraction of more. What is the agrarian crisis? The extraction of less, right? So as per this Jagirdari crisis, the Mughals, after Aurangzeb, they started collecting, or even during the time of Aurangzeb, what happened? They started collecting more. And why did they start collecting more? Reason was very simple, because the number of mansabdars were greater as compared to the number of Jagirs. And that is why they were not getting the Jagirs on regular basis. And that is why whenever they have been allotted the Jagirs, they always try to make more and more money from the land. And in process of that, in doing that, what they did, they started collecting some extra taxes, something which could be called as extra, and which ultimately increased the exploitation of the peasantry community. Because whenever state was fixing the land revenue, whenever the state was fixing the land revenue, they always tried to fix it in the same level, right? But it sometimes depended over the lower bureaucracy, that what was the amount they are collecting. And as I told you, in Jagirdari classes, they started collecting more. So state was fixing 10 rupees, right? State was fixing 10 rupees, and they started adding some amount in that. How come? Okay, fine, you need to pay the pasture land tax also. You need to pay ghari, right? So a tax over houses. Chari, right? The tax over the pasture land. So these were some additional taxes which were collected by the peasantry community. These are some mere examples that I am giving you. It might be of some other form that we will discuss in medieval, right? So somehow as they started collecting more, and ultimately you'll find that peasantry community has started going through a miserable condition, and as a result they started revolting. Whether there's another condition, due to, during this particular period, during this 18th century, as the state was not capable of performing that role properly, state was not capable of controlling the jamindars properly or the jagirdars properly, and as a result of that, what happened? They started collecting. Maybe that they were not extracting or exploiting the peasantry community. They are not exploiting the peasantry community, but as they are not passing it very regularly to the state, and that is why somehow they accumulated property, and as a result of that, they started dreaming some bigger things, like to be the ruler or to be the nawab. And these are the jamindars, or these are the jagirdars, those who revolted against this empire, and which is known as agrarian crisis, right? So these kind of studies have already been done even for the 18th century. But I think it was so far, whenever you do talk about that revenue extraction and all, one thing that always should be kept in mind, that once the Indian people were collecting the land revenue, so ultimately that money has been spent in India only, right? The money which was collected in name of land revenue, it was ultimately spent in India only, because somehow, as you do know, that if it is that community called as jamindar or jagirdar, so somehow they were just leading a lavish life. तो खत्म कर दिया, खर्च कर दिया उसमें, डांस में खत्म कर दिया, ठीक है, या फिर किस में करेंगे, या कपड़े अच्छे पहन लिए, रेशम के कपड़े पहन लिए, ठीक है, यही सब में करते थे. तो अल्टीमेटली मनी क्या होता था? सर्कुलेट हो जाता था इसी कंट्री में. और आई थिंक दैट इज नॉट एप्लीकेबल फॉर द colonial India, because during the colonial India, these people always wanted to extract the money to send it outside. And how were they doing it? Very simply, they were just collecting the land revenue from India. They were buying the Indian products with the help of that same money, and then they were selling the stuff in Britain or Europe, and that money was never coming back to India. But somehow it was not easy for the Indians during that particular period to understand this exploitation, because they always thought in a way that somehow they are selling their stuff, they were getting the money. They were supposed to pay their land revenue to someone. Initially also they were paying to some jamindar, jagidar, or whatever it is, right? So they are right now also they are paying the land revenue to someone. And the people, those who were involved in handicraft industries, initially they were selling their stuff, and in return they were getting some money. Still they were getting their money, and that is why they could not understand this, right? But I think they were not able to understand, but the colonial people were definitely able to understand what they are doing in India. And that is why these people have started thinking about, or they started making certain plans for this land revenue settlements in India. And as you do know that Bengal was the first area, June, which was colonized by them. They got the Diwani rights on 1765 for the first time in India, and that is where they started doing the experiments, because all the time they had this hunger for more and more land revenue, and that is why they all the time they kept on doing the experiments with the land revenue system. So once till 1772, what happened till 1772, the things were running in previous manner only, because that Indian people were appointed at the top, and the Indian people were collecting the land revenue, and then they were passing it to the the colonial officers or the colonial people. But after 1770, something happened as such, because of what they had to rethink about their land revenue settlement. So till 1770, they did not do any as such greater change or the broader change in land revenue settlements. But after 1770, when there was a great famine, and then they were forced actually to think about their land revenue collection system. Because in 1770, because look, if any famine is there, I think it was a natural calamity. Nobody can control it. But I think it matters that in what way you are equipped to face this natural calamity. So if you have certain amount of surplus, in that case definitely you'll be able to face it in a proper way. And 1770 famine was actually great famine, because it has been said it at least killed 1/3 of people from Bengal. So I think you can understand the intensity of this famine. So it was very sort of a devastating famine, and ultimately which forced them to think about this, right? And then Warren Hastings, who was the existing Governor General during the period, and finally Warren Hastings started doing numbers of experiments with this, right? While doing these experiments, what kind of things which were followed by him, like he started collecting the land revenue on annual basis, right? And somehow here onwards you'll find that direct intervention of the colonial rule started. They started collecting the land revenue directly from them, right, on yearly basis. What is this yearly basis land revenue collection? Everywhere they were fixing the land revenue, right, and then they were giving that amount, or they were fixing, just by fixing that amount, the amount has been told to the peasant, right? And then that fellow was supposed to pay the amount at the end of the year, right? So that was the annual sort of thing. Then they did a 5-year system also, right? So they fixed it for 5 years, and then they what was happening, what was the amount which was fixed, they were collecting it regularly or yearly, right? So these kind of systems were done by this fellow, by Warren Hastings, and unfortunately he failed in most of the systems, because the kind of expectations they had, it was not fulfilled. And I think there was a great reason behind this, was the Indian middlemen, right? Because as these people were not capable of collecting the land revenue directly from the peasantry community, and that is where they needed to get some people in the middle, and they must be Indians, right? So it has been said, look, these Indian people are always misguiding us, and the revenue is extracted from the peasantry community, but the profit was always kept by the middlemen, and that is why these people are getting prosperous, but the profit which the company should get, that the company is not getting. And that's the reason that these people have started inquiring their system. And finally at the end, what Warren Hastings did, that he established he imposed a system which is known as the revenue farming system, or the Ijara system. Revenue farming or Ijara system. I have already told you about this Ijara system. Who was the Bengali Nawab who implemented this system? कौन था? अली वर्दी खान, एग्जैक्टली. अली वर्दी खान ने क्या किया था, वो इजारा सिस्टम उसने लगाया था. एंड व्हाट इज दिस इजारा सिस्टम? रेवेन्यू फार्मिंग सिस्टम, सॉरी बिडिंग ऑफ फार्म्स. थोड़ा सा इसको करेक्ट करने की जरूरत है. कोई करेक्ट कर सकता? स्टेट. No. Partially? Yeah, exactly. It was the auctioning of the right to collect the land revenue, right? So as it is auction, so now Jamindars is not necessarily playing any important role, because any person who is buying the land, definitely that fellow became responsible for paying the land revenue. And when, in fact, whenever you are talking about that bidding or the auctioning of the right, of course the people were giving the highest bid. And once you have given the highest bid, then what is going to happen? More exploitation of the peasantry community. And sometimes there is a limit of exploitation, because some passive resistance is also there. It is not necessary that you are resisting actively every time. So the peasants sometimes resisted in a passive way also. There's a book called, क्या नाम है, The Cheese and Butter. Cheese and Butter. सुना है कभी नाम? नहीं. Have you ever heard the name of the book? Cheese and Butter. खाने की बात नहीं कर रहा हूँ मैं, एकदम रिच खाने की, ठीक है. There is a book called as Cheese and Butter, and that book is actually written on some communities from Southeast Asian countries. And in that book, that is the idea which was observed by the historian, where he tried to find out some passive resistance by the peasantry community or laborers also. It is not always necessary that you are actively resisting, right? Sometimes you are resisting in a passive way, right? Like you did not cultivate your land. छोड़ दो यार, जाने दो, देखते हैं क्या कर लेगा वो, वो कुछ नहीं कर सकता. And as far as your survival is concerned, you'll just work somewhere and you'll earn your survival. Got my point? So that is a sort of passive resistance, right? कभी क्या करते थे, अपना वही जला देते थे, जो अनाज का ढेर खड़ा है जला दिया उसको, ठीक है, अभी कर लो क्या करोगे, ठीक है. तो दे बहुत सारे पैसिव रेजिस्टेंस के फॉर्म्स होते थे, और अभी भी होता है. आप ये हर जगह नोटिस कर सकते हैं. जैसे लेबर्स कहीं काम कर रहे हैं, ठीक है, तो जैसे लंच का ऑफिसेज में भी होता है, क्यों लेबर्स की बात क्यों करें हम, ठीक है. जैसे 1 बजे से 1:30 बजे अगर लंच है, सरकारी ऑफिस में चले जाइए, ठीक है, 1 बजे से 1:30 बजे तक लंच होता है. 1 बजे से वो 15 मिनट पहले निकल जाएंगे और 15 मिनट बाद में आएंगे, ठीक है. बैंक में सबसे ज्यादा होता है, ठीक है. तो ये सब पैसिव, लेकिन वो लोग रेजिस्टेंस नहीं कर रहे, वो लोग कामचोर है, ठीक है. रेजिस्टेंस दूसरा होता है. जैसे आप क्या करेंगे, अब जो है जैसे फ्यूडलिज्म में क्या होता था कि आपने उसको कर दिया, आप फ्यूड्स को जो है वो एक्सप्लॉयटेशन करते थे, उनका जाते नहीं थे काम पे, ठीक है, 15 मिनट बैठे रहते थे. ऐसे ही एक बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट टॉपिक है जो आपने यूएसए में नहीं किया होगा. यूएसए में है कि स्लेव्स जो है, जो फीमेल स्लेव्स थी, वो कैसे रेजिस्ट करती थी, ठीक है. वो बोलती थी, झूठ मूठ बोलती थी कि प्रेग्नेंट है हम, ठीक है, अभी प्रेग्नेंट है, तो ज्यादा नहीं काम देते थे उनको, ठीक है. उनको लगता था स्लेव्स के बच्चे बहुत यूजफुल होते थे, क्योंकि वो फ्री के स्लेव्स होते थे, समझ रहे. They were the slaves, free slaves actually, because the master did not pay for that slave, and that is where they always promoted, the sexual relationship between the male and the female slaves. कि ठीक है, जो बच्चे आएंगे उसको जो है हम फ्री में slave बना के रखेंगे. And that is why what women did, they always used to claim कि we are pregnant, और we get a passive resistance है, ठीक है. तो इस तरीके के resistance होते थे उस समय में भी. तो what happened after this Ijara system? Basically, people have started reacting, in a passive way, and ultimately there was a, impact over the revenue collection, right? Because they were not capable of collecting that amount. And if the person who has, who bought this right, definitely if he is not collecting that much amount which he, promised to give to the state or to the colonial power, in that case definitely they were not, they were not giving the land revenue on time or the exact amount which they have promised. And that is where even in revenue farming, different kind of problems started. The exploitation of peasantry community, of course, increased, right? The people, those who bought the rights of revenue collection, right? These people also started struggling a lot. And in fact, what kind of expectation the colonial rule had, that was also not fulfilled, right? So every class was struggling in this, revenue farming system. And, this is the situation when some other things were also going on parallelly, like not in India, outside of India, such as 1786, the American War of Independence, right? and this is the periods between 1780 to 1783. Britain was fighting against France over this colonial issues and all, right. So these kind of things were going on parallelly, and even in the same time we'll find that the wars were going on in South India also, right, like Carnatic wars, Anglo-Maratha wars, right, Anglo-Mysore wars, numbers of other wars were also going on simultaneously, and that is why finally it has been felt, though actually that that they needed to get a fixed source of income, right, and that fixed source of income somehow could hold the the colonial empire in India. And most importantly, apart from all these problems, the most important problem they had was regarding their system which they tried to develop after getting this Diwani of Bengal. They just thought of collecting that land revenue, and with the help of that land revenue they were imagining of buying the Indian stuff and then selling it in Europe. Unfortunately, that idea was not working, because somehow they were not capable of collecting the proper amount of surplus or extra from the lands that could be used for the trade purpose. And that is why finally the company, even the British kingdom, the British parliament had to think something, and in such a scenario ultimately that fellow called as Cornwallis again sent to India to decide something about this land revenue. And it happened for the first time in India, right, that somebody who was not employed in British East India Company and he has been sent just to do some administrative or just to take some administrative measure, just to correct or fix this revenue settlement. So these are the tasks assigned to him, and finally Cornwallis landed in India, right. Cornwallis, अभी जब सलमान खान आता है तो थोड़ा अच्छे से कुछ करता है, ठीक है, तो he also started doing all those things, right. He started, and in fact one committee was also set up on 1786 called as Amini Committee, right. एक कमेटी भी बनाते हैं जिसको अमीनी कमेटी हम कहते हैं, ठीक है, 1786, and that committee has to find the flaws with the existing systems. Actually that committee had to find some flaws with the existing systems, right. Now, as you understand, Cornwallis, that's the only person you must be knowing about, as far as this permanent settlement is concerned. But actually, it is not true that he is not the only person behind this permanent settlement. Look, Cornwallis definitely has had certain biases. Why? Because he himself was coming from a Jamindari family. In fact, he himself was a landed magnate in Britain, and that is why he had certain biases towards this, or certain prejudice for the peasantry community, and he always favored the landed magnates. So that kind of ideas he had. Apart from that, he was actually representing the Whig idea of Britain. That was the another bias he had. So definitely his own ideas were also responsible. I am not denying this fact. So apart from his own ideas, the ideas of Cornwallis, right, there were some other people who also contributed a lot, right, and these people somehow are also considered responsible for starting a new land revenue settlement in India called as permanent settlement, right. So in this particular in these names, the first I would like to talk about one ideology called as physiocratic ideology, right. What is this physiocratic ideology? That ideology, physiocratic ideology, was, इसको बंद कर दीजिए. Physiocratic ideology. So what was this physiocratic ideology? The physiocratic ideology was actually talking about similar kind of things, right? So what kind of ideas have been given by physiocratic ideology, such as if you are deciding any particular class as the honor, right? or Jamindars as owner of the land, in that case definitely the improvement, that idea is very important, the idea of improvement, that they are going to get some improvement in the land, and in the future ultimately it is going to increase the revenue from the land, right? So this was the major central idea of this physiocratic ideology, and I hope you are getting my point, that Cornwallis was somehow inspired by this idea, right? And Cornwallis was simultaneously the person, or even apart from Cornwallis, some other people, these people always advocated about anglicizing this Indian system, because so far they experimented with the Indian systems like the land revenue farming, or the decennial system, or the annual system, and in every system they have failed, and that is why now they thought of anglicizing this land revenue system. And there, as I told you, that some other person such as Henry Patullo, right, Alexander Doe, right, so Philip Francis, so these are some other people, those who were already working in this direction, such as Francis. He was one of the person working with Warren Hastings, right? And from the beginning he was advocating, or he was just suggesting an alternative kind of land revenue system, but somehow nobody was there to listen to him, though he was part of this council. But even though people were not ready to listen, or Warren Hastings was not listening him, because Warren Hastings always found that the Indian systems are the best system, and that is why we must follow the Indian system. Whether these people were suggesting, as I told you, that different alternative kind of system. And finally Cornwallis entered into this country, and as he himself was inspired by those ideas, and that is why those who were supporting these kind of ideas in India, so finally they all joined their hands together, and finally they developed a system called as permanent settlement, and that system was implemented on 1793, right? But I think that's a factual information, that on 1793 that permanent settlement was introduced in India. But before introducing this permanent settlement in India, we need to understand the real compulsion for introducing this, right? So there were two different kind of compulsions that must be discussed here: economic compulsion and political compulsion, right? So there were two different kind of compulsions which ultimately forced them to implement permanent settlement in India. So what was this economic compulsion? Economic compulsion क्या हो सकता है? Exactly. I just now discussed about the economic compulsion. Somehow what they were expecting to get from this country, they were not getting it. And at the same time, their expenditure, right, was increasing day by day. And that's the reason that they wanted to meet their expenditure. And in order to, in order to that, right, they had to develop their economic system in India. And as it was the only area from where they were getting this, land revenue, and that is why it has to be fixed, in a way that it could hold the colonial empire in India, right? And I think, once you talk about this early phase, of the colonial rule, so I'll be just giving you one condition, and you yourself decide when you are beginning your career. Suppose you have done engineering, right? And then you have, after completing your engineering, you have two different kind of offers. In one offer you are getting regular salary, and in another offer you are getting commission, right? So suppose you sold the stuff of 100 rupees, out of 100 rupees 2 rupees would be your commission. ठीक है, आप किस में जाएंगे? किस में? रेगुलर फिक्स सैलरी में, जाएंगे ना? हाँ, डिपेंड करता है. कैसे डिपेंड करता है? डिपेंड करता है, बहुत सारे अदर फैक्टर्स भी हो सकते हैं. बट ज्यादातर लोगों ने कौन सा आइडिया सपोर्ट किया? फिक्स सैलरी वाले. एंड वंस यू हैव एक्यूमुलेटेड सम प्रॉपर्टी, राइट, ठीक है, आपके पास अपना घर है, गाड़ी है, इतना बैंक बैलेंस है, 1 लाख रुपए महीने का उसका इंटरेस्ट आ जाता है, और तब फिर यही दो ऑफर्स आते हैं, तब किस पे जाएंगे आप? तब आई थिंक यू कैन गो फॉर दिस कमीशन बेस, बिकॉज देयर डेफिनेटली यू हैव लॉट्स ऑफ स्कोप in the commission based service, because there if you are performing good, in that case you can might earn greater amount, whether in fixed salary it was always limited. So I think that is the condition of the colonial rule right now, as it is the beginning of their rule in India, and that is where they needed to get a fixed income that they could make their budget, right? And as per the budget, they could plan their further or future activities. And that's the reason that they had to get this permanent, they had to go for this permanent settlement. So this was the economic compulsion under which they had to decide something like that, right? But at the same time, there was one political objective also for this permanent settlement. And what was that political objective? For? No, that's a different. That was the economic, requirement. That was the economic requirement. But they had certain political goals and objectives as well. And that was also highlighted by Cornwallis. This is also one of the reasons because of what I have decided to go for this permanent settlement. Sorry? Exactly, right? They just wanted to they just wanted to get support of a class, right, in India, and at least they wanted, to get a loyal class in India, and on the basis of what they could imagine or they could dream something else, something bigger, right? And as they just thought of, declaring the Jamindars as owner of the land, and that is where they thought in a way that it must be helping them to get the loyalty of this particular class, and ultimately in future that class is going to class is going to be the pillar on what they could stand, or they could they could make this colonial empire in India. So that was the another thing because of what they decided this permanent settlement, right? So finally on 1793 the permanent settlement was imposed in India, right? Or it was initiated in India, basically that in Bengal presidency. Now once as far as this permanent settlement is concerned, so what were the features of the permanent settlement? That's the another thing which is important, right? So there are few important features of permanent settlement. The first was Jamindars were declared as owner of the land. And I think I have discussed it in the class that in what way it was supposed to be very important in India, because once Jamindars were declared as owner of the land, and that particular right, that right of ownership was never very much clear in India, because I just told you in India there was different kind of system where the king is there, right, Jamindar is there, and Rayat is there, and who is owning the land, that was always debatable, right? And different kind of ideas have been given for this, because some say that king was owning the land, whether some say Jamindars were having a sort of hereditary right over the land, whether some people say it was the peasantry community which was owning the land. But I think it is not that much easy to fix it, because in India there was no as such crisis of land, and just because of that purpose, just because of that reason, you never find a land market in India. And that's the reason that ownership could not be fixed in a very simplistic way in India. So there was a different kind of system which was functioning in India. Though historians tried to answer this particular question on the on the basis of some contemporary sources, like even during the ancient Indian, we do have examples for selling and purchasing of land, but such kind of references are very less, and that cannot be applied for the agricultural land or cultivable land, right? And that is why that ownership right was, most of the time you'll find it was very vague in India. And that's the reason that the colonial people or the permanent settlement claimed that as they declared the Jamindars as the owner of land, that is supposed to be the great achievement for them. And in fact, it was the beginning of a new system in India. So that is why, this is one of the important features. What else? Permanent settlement? Yeah. So the Jamindars were basically now going to get the hereditary rights over the land. So the Jamindars were now going to get this hereditary right over the land. So that is the another important feature. The land rights were transferable now. Land rights were transferable now. That's the another important feature. What else? Fixed land revenue, right? The next feature is that it was permanent. How come it was permanent? So I'm just simply telling you that the land revenue was supposed fixed as 11 rupees, right? So if the land revenue was fixed 11 rupees, and that was fixed by the colonial power only, right, or the the company only. So that was fixed. That 11 rupees was fixed as land land revenue, and 10 by 11 was given to company, and 1 by 11 was kept by the Jamindar, right? And that was fixed for coming 20 years. That revenue settlement was fixed for coming 20 years. So that is what known as, that is why it is known as permanent settlement, right? One more thing was there in this settlement, that was known as sunset theory. What was this sunset theory? On a fixed date, they had to pay the land revenue. That's it. On a fixed date before the sunset, they had to pay the land revenue. That is why it is called as sunset theory. And that date could not change at any condition, right? And I think you can understand it was almost all impossible to pay the land revenue on a fixed date, because it depends on various factors. आपका हार्वेस्ट सीजन कब आता है, ठीक है, वो आगे पीछे भी हो सकता है, डिपेंडिंग अप टू द वेदर कंडीशन and some other things, right? So I think it was it was not possible, but even though they got this sunset theory, right? So all such features were there in permanent settlement, and finally it was started in India on 1793, right? And after the beginning of permanent settlement, in India, you'll find so many negative aspects of permanent settlement, right? There were so many negative aspects of permanent settlement. But before, and in fact, what were the reasons for these negative aspects? That's a matter of question. Because once you talk about this permanent settlement, so the first question which comes, right, that was this land revenue, greater than the amount collected previously from the peasantry community, or it was same? And as you do understand, different kind of ideas have been given, and most of the imperial historians, they were not ready to accept any kind of increase was there in the revenue settlement. And there we can discuss about one popular historian called as P.J. Marshall, right? P.J. Marshall. P.J. Marshall has calculated the land revenue from 1765 to 93, and he only found 20% increase in land revenue. Whether B.B. Chaudhary, Binay Bhushan Chaudhary find 100% growth in the same period. Got the point, right? So for B.B. Chaudhary, if it was 50 rupees, it became 100 rupees, right? And for P.J. Marshall, if it was 50 rupees, it became only 60 rupees, right? So P.J. Marshall or the other imperial group, historians also tried to show that there was no as such remarkable increase in that, right? So that is how it has been concluded. But at the same time, you must remember, if there is a growth of only 20%, okay, fine, we accept this figure, even though that amount mattered a lot for the peasantry community. Because if initially they were giving 100 rupees and now they were forced to give 120 rupees, and just within 20 years, because in those 20 years, because you do know that in agriculture the changes do not take place in a rapid speed, right? So it always takes time. So in just 20 years, in a span of 20 years, even less than 20 years, right? It's around 20 years, right, or 25 years. If it has been increased by 20%, that also was supposed to be a sort of pressure or burden over the peasantry community. And that is why one thing that is pretty sure, that yes, definitely the revenue demand was increased and the negative impact could be seen on the peasantry community. But I think this is not the only reason because of what such kind of negative impacts of the land revenue permanent settlement could be seen in India. There were so many things which were actually very frustrating, and because of what the land revenue settlement could not function properly. Now, what were the problems with this system? That is what we need to understand. So the basic idea behind the implementation of the land permanent settlement was that the improvement, I just told you that particular term improvement should be in inverted commas, because all the time what Cornwallis highlighted, as we have declared the, the Jamindars as owner of the land, in that case the Jamindars are going to, invest some amount in the land. And that is what happened in Britain, because in Britain the landed magnates always used to invest some money in the land, because as if some money has been invested just for better technologies, better irrigation facilities, making some embankments and bunds and some other things, so it is very much, likely that the community, that Jamindari community, would invest their money into this. Because why? Because ultimately the empire was concerned of 10 rupees. Got my point? The empire was only concerned of this 10 rupees. So instead of 11, if this, Jamindar is collecting 15, in that case also they were supposed to give company to 10 rupees only, and the rest 5 will be kept by the Jamindar. So somehow they found that it is such kind of motivation, it is such kind of, of motivational factor which could always inspire the Jamindar to invest in land, and ultimately as a result of that he would be able to increase his income from the land. And as I told you that it was going to be revised after a long period, and that is why he just thought of such kind of changes in the agriculture, right? But unfortunately anything did not happen in India, because it was India, right? Rather it promoted this different kind of terms, right, or different kind of systems in India. What are those different terms or different systems which were which developed in India? Such as sub-infeudation. What is this sub-infeudation? Very simple. I got the land, ठीक है. I got the land, right? I'm the Jamindar. So over the period I made some money. Definitely Jamindars were making some money, right? कोई doubt नहीं है इसमें. So I just thought of shifting to the cities. अच्छा है ना, शहर में चले जाएंगे, लाट साहब बन के रहेंगे, इधर गांव में क्या पड़ा है. Then I choose Kirti, right? Okay, fine, you just pay me this much amount of money and I'll give this right to you, right? So finally, and mind you that I am the person who is known as Jamindar, right? So C became the middleman, right? Now C started collecting some money, and finally what happened? C, after a period of time, C also made some good amount of money, and C also started thinking in the same way. Then C chose, नाम भूल गया यार, Sandeep. C chose Sandeep, right? Sandeep further chose Saket. Saket further chose George. George in the so on, right? So finally what happened? You'll find that between Jamindar and the peasant there were at least 12 layers. I think this figure is itself sufficient to tell you the exploitation of the peasantry community, which is known as sub-infeudation, right? There is another system which became prominent. Another system which became prominent in this permanent settlement, that is what called as sub-infeudation. What was another system? Absentee landlordism. Absentee landlordism. What is this absentee landlordism? No, it's a different kind of thing. Any idea for this absentee landlordism? Absent हो गए वो. Look, I just told you about that sunset theory, right? And simultaneously I told you, that time only I told you that it was almost not, it was impossible to pay the land revenue on every year on the same time, right? And that is where the fluctuations were very, somehow it became very general feature in permanent settlement. So if somebody had to save their land revenue, their right In that case, what they did actually, they started getting borrowing money. They started borrowing money, right, from the capitalist people actually. So by this time you'll find that there were so many people, those who were working as associate, those were working as associates of the company, and these people had some some good amount of money. So such as like I told you about that Marwari community which shifted from from Rajasthan to Bengal area, and these people had some good amount. Even the Armenians, right? So that also, this is also one of the community which gets which made some good money. Even from Bengal also, you'll find that some people somehow managed to get the jobs in the colonial in the company, and these people were also making good money, and they were the people who were actually paying the revenue to the company on behalf of the Jamindar. So over the period they started thinking in a way that if they are paying the land revenue, right, why not to start buying the land in the rural areas? Because if the Jamindars were not capable of paying the land revenue on time, in that case their land was seized. Their land was seized, and later on it was auctioned. So in such auctions, the alien people started buying the land in the rural areas, right? And in fact, these people were never living in those areas, right? And they were always living in cities because they were some big businessmen, they were big, capitalist people. But they bought the land in the rural areas, and somehow they were not there to manage the land. And in that case, they appointed somebody else to manage the land. And that was that kind of situation continued, and which is known as absentee landlordism. In fact, just because of this sunset theory, the auctioning of land started, it became a common or general phenomena in Bengal, and you'll find around 60% of lands got auctioned in Bengal, because most of the big jamindars were now not able to save their land holdings or their jamindari, right? And in fact, they started selling their land, or they started, their lands got auctioned, and that is how they got their jamindaris, right? And this became one of the general phenomena. So either these people were replaced by such kind of alien people, or they were replaced by their associates only. The jamindar, sometimes you'll find, we have some good number of cases where once the land was auctioned, so the person who was actually controlling at the ground level the things, that fellow bought the right of, or that fellow bought this zamindari, and finally he became the next zamindar. So these kind of phenomena became very common in India, very common in permanent settlement area, and that is where it started the absentee landlordism also. And as you can understand that alien people and some people, though those who were working in the colonial offices, they started buying the land, right? So that was the another negative impact of this permanent settlement. What else? What else? Sorry? Mode of? हाँ गोल्ड में है, या फिर उस समय तक तो करेंसी इन लोगों ने शुरू कर दिया था. What else? और क्या प्रॉब्लम हो सकती है? What kind of other problems you can notice with the system? जीवन को देखा है? हिंदी फिल्मों में जो होता है जीवन, देखा ना? That जीवन is becoming part of the rural society. That जीवन was never part of the rural society so far, right? But now it became one of the most important class of money lender in the rural society, right? So basically these people, as the villagers were also, the peasants were also not capable of paying the land revenue on time, and they were also forced by the jamindars to pay the land revenue on time. In that case, that money lenders started entering into the rural areas. They were giving the cash to the people, to those people, right? To the basically to the peasantry community, right? Peasants, right? And once you have taken the money from the money lender, then what is happening, or what happened, that you do know. एक बार आपने पैसे ले लिए तो जिंदगी में आप कई जनरेशन निकल जाएंगे, आप उनका पैसा नहीं चुकेगा कभी, ठीक है? और आप एक के बाद एक जनरेशन जो है वो काम करते जाएंगे उनके पास, वो सिस्टम जो है चलता रहेगा, ठीक है? तो दैट मनी लैंडर सिस्टम आल्सो एंटर्ड इनटू द रूरल एरियाज. व्हाट एल्स? Did it give expected result to the company? No. somehow what kind of expectations they had, okay fine, this is a moderate system, and as per that system they were going to get the money regularly. That did not happen, and somehow they realized at the end that this system is not going to work for a longer period, and that is where they started talking about modifications and other things. So it was not even good for the company also, right? But out of all these important, negative aspects, I think the most important negative aspect was regarding the ownership right, right? Because I just told you that so far what happened, this system was there in India and nobody knew about the ownership right. So the king, the rayats were cultivating the land and giving the revenue to the jamindar. Just by keeping one side, jamindar was passing it to the king or the badshah. That was the system functioning in India. So somehow in India, the peasants were known as rayat, not as peasant, because the ownership right was not decided. And if the owners, and normally the peasants or the people, those who are cultivating the land, if they are owning also, they were known as peasant, right? And if they are not owning the land, in that case, they are known as landless laborers, right? And in India, there was a system called as rayat. Why they were known as rayat? Because they did not own the land, but they had a tenancy right over the land, right? Nobody could replace them from the land if he is continuously paying the land revenue to the state or the jamindar. And that is why they were known as rayat. So they had a sort of right which is known as tenancy right, and rayat, and after the rayat his son, and again his son, right? And that was the system which was followed in India. But now, as you understand, if the jamindars were declared as the landowners, so in that case the peasants or the rayats converted into landless labor, right? So it actually decreased the status of the peasantry community. Now they are not peasant anymore, they became the landless labor. And I hope you can connect it with the situation of Bengal right now, because Bengal is one of the poorest state or province in India, and the reason lies in the fact because there was a such kind of system, and this system always exploited the people in the region, and that is why we can say that permanent settlement became one of the reason, because of what their condition became like this. So this is what called as permanent settlement, though it continued for a very long period, right? But I hope you can understand that somehow it had most of the things, most of the provisions of the permanent settlement were not functioning properly. It had numbers of loopholes and lacunas, right? And that is why it had numbers of negative impacts over the society, right? This is what known as permanent settlement, nothing else. Clear? Okay, so as far as this permanent settlement is concerned, have you seen the notes? कितने लोगों ने नोट्स देखा परमानेंट सेटलमेंट के? नहीं देखा है. नोट्स मिला है ना इधर से? किस लिए मिला है? यूज क्या है उसका? सॉरी, तो क्यों नहीं पहुंचे यार? ऐसे भी कोई बहुत ज्यादा स्पीड थोड़ी कि नहीं पहुंच पा रहे. रिफॉर्म तो अभी तक तो हम सोशल रिफॉर्म, जो नहीं पहुंचे वो पढ़ रहे हो, जहां पहुंच गए हैं वो नहीं पढ़ रहे हो यार. एनसीईआरटी में नहीं, एनसीईआरटी की बात नहीं कर रहा हूं मैं, नोट्स की बात कर रहा हूं, ठीक है. इन द नोट्स विल फाइंड दैट परमानेंट सेटलमेंट हैज बीन गिवन इन अ गुड वे, राइट. पेजेंट्री नहीं, नॉट इन परमानेंट सेटलमेंट, that was in Rayatwari settlement, right? Okay, so most of the things have been given in a good way, in a good manner in notes. So that is why I'll be just dictating about some other aspects of permanent settlement rather than the like the features of permanent settlement and the problems with the permanent settlement. These are given and in fact the critical analysis of the permanent settlement has also been given in a very good way. So basically I'll be talking about the ideological origin of permanent settlement, right? Achha, one more thing. Okay, fine. I just missed to tell you. There was a a very complicated kind of problem with the permanent settlement that you need to understand, because now it has been fixed that the revenue has to be collected in cash, right? And once the revenue is collected in cash, whosoever is collecting revenue in cash, there is a very genuine kind of problem with this, because now suppose that amount has been fixed as 110 rupees, right? And suppose I am a jamindar, right? Or suppose I am the person. This is the total area. This is Bengal, right? That has been divided in, different jamindaris, right? And out of this, suppose I became the jamindar of this area, right? And now what happened? Definitely I am getting this land cultivated with the help of the rayats. Now they are landless laborers, right? And so I just did this settlement individually with the people, those who are cultivating my land. Getting my point? This is the Bengal, right? And that Bengal has been divided among four jamindars. I, as a jamindar, got this land. I did this settlement individually with the peasants, those who were, basically landless labor, those who are working in their respective areas, and I fixed it with individually. Suppose I had to get 110 rupees at the end, and there were suppose 11, or suppose imagine that they all are having equal amount of land. In that case, I needed to collect from everyone 10 rupees, right? But वो start कर दिया है, started ना. But there is a very genuine kind of problems. Once I need to pay it in cash, in cash. In that case, after harvesting, the crop, I need to sell it in the market. Of course, if I need to get it in cash, right? I need to sell it in market, right? But I hope you all do know that immediately after the harvest, the prices are getting down. Suppose my production was, I need to get 10 rupees now. Suppose my production was 15 kgs. Suppose my production was 15 kgs, and it has been calculated in a way that if I am selling, suppose there's 1 rupees per kg. So in that case, if I am selling 10 kgs, I'll be getting 10 rupees, the share which I have to give to the jamindar, right? But as the prices are down, in that case, what is happening? Instead of selling 10 kgs, I need to sell around 13 kgs to get the same amount, right? And now I'm just left with 2 kgs only. That is not sufficient to feed my family. And in that case, maybe for 4 months or 5 months, I have been working as a peasant, and in rest 7 and 8 months. So now, as it is not sufficient to feed my family, and that is why for rest of 7 and 8 months I'll be working as a labor. Some other works I have to do because I don't have any other option. So that also, this collection of revenue in cash also increased the exploitation of the peasantry community. That is also one of the means through which the peasantry community was exploited. मार्केट में नहीं डाउन कहाँ हुआ, तो ऑटोमेटिकली तो नेचर ऑफ मार्केट है. जब सप्लाई ज़्यादा होगा तो प्राइस तो अपने आप कम हो जाएगा, ठीक है. एंड आई थिंक द बिगर और द some long term impact of this was conversion, or the people have started, the peasants have started adopting the commercial crops, or they started cultivating the commercial crops. Why? Because there was no much price fluctuation in the commercial crop, because there was regular demand of such kind of things, such as indigo, such as jute, right? Because it was okay, later on tea. So as it was easy to sell such kind of stuff, and most of the time they were not supposed to sell it in the market, because the middlemen, right, or the buyers were coming to them directly to buy these stuff, because these were in high demand. And that is why gradually they started shifting to the commercial cultivation, and that also became one of the prime reason for the regular famines in Bengal area, because it is not only 1717, even after that you'll find regular famines were coming in Bengal. So I think that's the result of this also. Okay, fine. The establishment of colonial rule, the establishment of colonial rule in Bengal brought many changes, and one of them was in agrarian sector. Many of them what did I say? Many changes, and one of them was in agrarian sector. A new semi-feudal structure replaced the old feudal one. Old feudal one. Full stop. Land converted into a commodity. The notion of private property came into society. The legal system developed in land ownership, and most importantly, India got connected with the world capitalist market. Change the paragraph. Under the influence of Orientalism, Warren Hastings did many experiments with land revenue system in Bengal. But once he was replaced by Cornwallis, who was under the influence of Whig ideology, Whig political ideology, tried to anglicize anglicize the revenue structure in India. Cornwallis was under pressure of, Cornwallis was appointed, what did I say? ठीक है. But once he was replaced by Cornwallis, who was under the influence of political ideology, tried to anglicize the revenue structure in India. What? Okay. Sorry. उसके आगे क्या बोला था? Cornwallis was appointed under the pressure of some other circumstances as well, such as the American War of Independence, and the American-French Wars. This was the period when Parliament was trying to bring the company under more regulation, of the crown. Even the idea that the revenue collected from Bengal would help the company to run their trade was also not meeting to their expectations. Edmund Burke, E-D-M-U-N-D, Edmund, B-U-R-K-E, Edmund Burke, a renowned political thinker, comma, was a great critique of company's government under Hastings. And he was regularly advocating a change in the revenue structure of Bengal, in Bengal. Change the paragraph. Under these situations, Cornwallis was sent to India who was inspired by English Whig philosophy. English Whig, W-H-I-G, Whig philosophy. English Whig philosophy. He wanted to remove the Oriental influence. He wanted to remove the Oriental influence from the company and interested in Anglicizing it. Full stop. Philip Francis. Sorry, there were some other people. Sorry, cut it. But it does not mean that permanent settlement was the brainchild of Cornwallis. Philip Francis, working with Hastings, had already argued that Bengal's Jamindars not only possessed certain revenue rights that had become hereditary revenue rights that had become hereditary but they were also owners of land from which they collected revenue. Apart from him, the idea of permanent settlement got the support of a whole range of company officials and European observers such as Alexander Doe, DOE, Alexander Doe, Thomas Law, Henry Patullo, HENRI, Henry Patullo, PATULLO, Henry Patullo, etc. They all shared the physiocratic ideology. Of late 18th century, in bracket write down Ranjit Guha. The physiocrats in France deeply influenced by the transformation and success of English agriculture. क्या हो, कोई प्रॉब्लम है? नहीं ना? English agriculture after the enclosure movement. Gave primacy to land, as the source of all wealth. The social philosophy upon which the social philosophy upon which this doctrine implicitly rested consisted in placing above all else private property spatially property in land. This philosophy also believed in the notion of improvement under inverted comma, improvement in both land and landholders. As key of success or as key of English prosperity. Change the paragraph. Henry Patullo and Thomas Dow, D-O-W, both regarded the famine of 1770 as conclusive evidence of the worthlessness of existing economic policies. दो नहीं लिख लीजिएगा, DOE, Doe was critical of the Diwani system as he considered that this system ruined the country. Should country and in India, landed property should be established. Should be established. So he suggested the creation of private property in land and some permanent arrangement for revenue collection. Revenue collection. Henry Patullo also had similar ideas. He further suggested that security of property rights would induce prosperous Indians to invest in land. The officials thus gradually came round to the position that sound administration of land must have security of ownership as its basis. Nothing short of a permanent settlement could ensure change the paragraph. But as Ranjit Guha suggested, that security of revenue was not the sole motivation behind permanent settlement. there were at least three other critical objectives. There were three other critical objectives which the introduction of permanent settlement intended to serve. Which the introduction of permanent settlement intended to serve. Thus, creation of private property in land, creation of private property in land, comma, creation of improving landlords, and capital formation and agricultural development. That's it. Right? So this you are going to be going to add in the information which is there in the notes, right? You write down a note below that. The information on permanent settlement. The information on permanent settlement in the printed notes must be studied with